While my wife was away on a business trip, I decided to surprise her by replacing our master bathroom bathtub. I hauled the old cast iron tub out and accidentally dropped it against the ceramic tile. The custom wooden skirting shattered into pieces. What fell out from the hidden cavity beneath froze the blood in my veins. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated you. I brought the heavy sledgehammer down against the cast iron rim of the old bathtub. The sharp crack of metal echoed against the bathroom tiles, sending a shockwave up my forearms. I am 65 years old and a retired general contractor. My joints ache on cold mornings, but my hands still possess the strength that built a comfortable life for my family. Cynthia had left for a real estate conference in Seattle 2 days ago. She had been complaining about this outdated bathroom for over a year. I decided to tear it down to the studs and give her the modern spa she constantly talked about. I wedged my heavy steel crowbar beneath the rim of the tub to pry it free from the wooden pedestal. Cynthia had insisted on hiring a private contractor to build that cedar surround last spring. She claimed my back could no longer handle the intricate carpentry. I relented to keep the peace. I gripped the edge of the heavy iron tub and heaved it upward. Sweat stung my eyes. My work boots slipped on the wet ceramic floor. The massive weight of the cast iron shifted out of my grasp. The tub crashed downward with a deafening impact. The heavy iron smashed completely through the custom cedar skirting, splintering the expensive wood into jagged shards and cracking the floor tiles beneath it. I knelt down to inspect the damage to the subfloor. Through the jagged hole in the ruined cedar paneling, I noticed a dark void. The contractor Cynthia hired had intentionally built a false cavity behind the plumbing access panel. Resting inside that hidden space was a heavy steel lockbox. I reached into the dark hollow and pulled the cold metal box out into the light. It was secured with a thick brass padlock. I stared at it. A lockbox did not belong hidden behind bathroom plumbing. My pulse quickened with a sudden and sharp instinct. I grabbed my crowbar, wedged the forked end into the shackle of the padlock, and threw my entire body weight against the steel handle. The brass lock snapped and hit the floor. I threw the lid open. A thick stack of cream-colored papers lay perfectly organized inside. I pulled out the top folder. The letterhead belonged to a prestigious neurology clinic in the city. I scanned the first paragraph, and my breath stopped in my throat. It was a comprehensive medical evaluation bearing my full name, date of birth, and social security number. The diagnosis detailed a rapid cognitive decline. The attending physician, a neurologist I had never met in my life, certified that I was suffering from advanced early-onset dementia. The report stated I was completely incapable of managing my own finances or making basic life decisions. The pieces of a very disturbing puzzle suddenly slammed into place. For the last 6 months, Cynthia had been subtly altering my reality. She would hide my truck keys and later claim I had absent-mindedly left them inside the refrigerator. She would insist we had conversations about expenses that I had absolutely no memory of ever having. When I argued with her, she would look at me with a sickening display of pity, gently patting my hand and telling me my memory was just slipping with age. It was not natural aging. It was a meticulously crafted stage play, designed to establish a history of mental failure. I shoved the medical files aside and grabbed the next document in the box. It was a life insurance policy. Decades ago, I had taken out a modest policy to ensure my family would not struggle if an accident happened on a construction site. The document in my hands was a freshly approved addendum. The payout had been quadrupled to an absolutely staggering amount. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. My name was signed with flawless precision. It was a perfect forgery. I flipped to the beneficiary page. Cynthia and my son Cameron were listed as the sole irrevocable beneficiaries. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I had spent 40 years breaking my back on construction sites to pay for Cameron to attend an elite business school. He grew up despising my dirty work boots and my calloused hands. He constantly made snide remarks about my blue-collar roots, yet he never hesitated to accept the checks I wrote to cover his expensive lifestyle. I always brushed off his arrogance as youthful ignorance. I never imagined that his entitlement had morphed into something this sinister. My own flesh and blood had conspired with my wife to put a price tag on my life. I dug deeper into the lockbox and found a cheap, prepaid mobile phone resting at the bottom. I pressed the power button. The screen glowed brightly in my dark, dust-filled hands. The battery was fully charged. A notification icon indicated a new text message. I opened the messaging application. The texts were from an unsaved number, but the arrogant tone of the writing was unmistakably Cameron. I read the glowing words and felt the last shred of my paternal love wither and die. The message from Cameron stated that the lawyer had confirmed the conservatorship papers were completely finalized. He wrote that they only needed me to suffer one more documented medical episode to prove to a judge that I could no longer live independently. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read Cynthia's reply sent just 1 hour ago. She wrote that she was coming home a day early tomorrow afternoon. She instructed Cameron to leave the sedatives on the kitchen counter. She explicitly detailed her plan to mix a heavy dose of the untraceable pills into my evening tea to simulate a debilitating stroke. She promised they would call the ambulance by noon the following day. Cynthia was not at a real estate conference in Seattle. She was hiding in a local hotel, actively plotting my execution. I stood alone in the wreckage of the bathroom. I did not break down. I did not shed a single tear. The initial shock evaporated, leaving behind an icy and absolute clarity. My family believed I was a failing, incompetent old man who could easily be pushed aside. They expected me to drink their poison and quietly surrender my wealth and my freedom. They had severely underestimated the man who built their entire world. I looked at the burner phone and realized the clock was ticking. It was Friday night. I had less than 24 hours before my wife walked through the front door to kill me. I carefully placed the documents and the phone back into the steel box. I left the shattered cedar skirting and the broken tiles exactly as they were. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I am Stanley, 65 years old and a retired general contractor. While my wife was away on a supposed business trip, I decided to surprise her by tearing out and replacing our master bathroom bathtub. When I hauled the old cast-iron tub out, my grip slipped and I dropped it against the ceramic floor. The custom wooden skirting shattered into jagged pieces. What spilled out from a concealed cavity beneath those floorboards froze the blood in my veins. Before I dive into exactly how I systematically destroyed the people who plotted against me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your intelligence and your worth. I walked away from the ruined cast-iron tub and left the shattered cedar paneling exactly where it fell. I closed the master bathroom door until the latch clicked into place, sealing the physical evidence of their conspiracy behind me. The silence of my own house pressed against my ears. It no longer felt like the peaceful sanctuary I had spent decades building and maintaining. It felt like a cage carefully constructed by the people I loved most. My heavy work boots made deliberate thuds against the hardwood floor as I walked down the long hallway toward my home office. I stepped inside and firmly locked the solid oak door. The room was dark, save for the ambient afternoon light filtering through the blinds. I sat down in my heavy leather desk chair. My muscles still burned from swinging the sledgehammer, but the physical exhaustion was completely overshadowed by a freezing, absolute clarity. I reached for the power button on my computer tower. The cooling fans whirred to life and the monitor cast a pale blue glow across the calloused skin of my hands. Those hands had framed houses, poured concrete foundations, and hung drywall for 40 years to ensure my son would never have to sweat for a paycheck. Cameron despised manual labor. He always wore tailored suits and mocked the dirt under my fingernails, but he never hesitated to spend the wealth those dirty hands generated. I opened the web browser and navigated to the secure portal for our primary joint bank accounts. Cynthia always handled our day-to-day finances. She was the one with the advanced business degree. Early in our marriage, we established a strict division of labor. I built the houses and brought in the checks. She managed the books and paid the bills. For 30 years, I trusted her implicitly, with every single dime I earned. That blind trust was the greatest mistake of my life. I typed in my credentials and pressed enter. The financial dashboard loaded onto the screen. I stared at the bold, black numbers, waiting for my mind to make sense of the math. The balance in our primary joint checking account was a mere fraction of what it should have been. I clicked over to the high-yield savings account. The screen refreshed, displaying a balance of less than $500. A lifetime of disciplined savings had been entirely gutted. The shock was a physical blow to my chest, causing a sudden inability to draw air into my lungs. But I did not panic. I leaned closer to the monitor and clicked on the transaction history. I needed to see the precise anatomy of their theft. The digital ledger revealed a systematic and ruthless bleeding of my life savings. It started subtly 2 years ago. Small, consistent withdrawals categorized as routine household maintenance and legal consulting fees. Then about 8 months ago, the pattern aggressively escalated. Massive lump sums had been wired directly out of the accounts. I traced the origin of the largest missing funds and discovered a staggering reality. Someone had initiated a massive home equity line of credit against our fully paid-off property. I pulled up the loan origination documents attached to the digital banking file. My signature was perfectly forged on the bottom line. Cynthia and Cameron had mortgaged the roof over my head without my knowledge. I followed the money trail. Every single wire transfer, including the massive equity disbursements, had been routed to a corporate bank account under the name of a limited liability company I did not recognize. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the State Business Registry database. I typed in the corporate registration number attached to the mysterious shell company. The page loaded, displaying the corporate officers. The sole managing director of the company was Valerie, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who sat at my Thanksgiving table pouring my wine and complimenting my cooking while wearing designer jewelry I had unknowingly paid for. I dug deeper into the public financial filings linked to her shell company. The stolen funds did not stay in Valerie's account. They were immediately funneled directly into Cameron's technology startup. For the past 3 years, Cameron had bragged at every family gathering about securing millions of dollars in venture capital funding for his software company. He drove a brand new imported sports car and lived in a luxury downtown penthouse. He looked down on my blue-collar retirement, constantly reminding me that his intellect had far surpassed my manual labor. It was all a breathtaking, elaborate lie. His company was a total failure. No venture capitalists were funding his lavish lifestyle. My sweat, my broken back, and my stolen home equity were financing his entire fraudulent empire. The anger crystallized in my veins, hardening into something cold and incredibly dangerous. I understood exactly what was happening. Cameron had bled me dry to keep his sinking business afloat. Now that the savings were gone and the house was mortgaged to the absolute limit, I had outlived my financial usefulness. I was an empty vault. The only asset I had left was the massive life insurance policy hidden in the lockbox down the hall. They needed me dead to collect the final payout. My first instinct was to wait for Cynthia to walk through the front door, confront her with the printed bank statements, and throw her out onto the street. But the cold logic of the situation quickly killed that impulse. If I confronted them now, I would lose everything. They held the forged medical records declaring me a victim of advanced dementia. They held the legal high ground. If I caused a scene, Cynthia would simply call the police, produce the fraudulent medical diagnosis, and claim I was having a violent, confused episode. A shouting match would end with me strapped to a gurney in a locked psychiatric ward. They would assume full legal control of my remaining estate, and I would be silenced forever. I could not simply fight them. I had to destroy them completely. I needed a weapon far more dangerous than a sledgehammer. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk and pushed aside stacks of old construction invoices. I pulled out a worn leather-bound address book. The pages were yellowed and fragile. I flipped past the contacts of plumbers, electricians, and roofers, stopping at the letter P. I stared at the name written in faded black ink. Vince Powell. 30 years ago, Vince and I started a commercial development company together. I handled the construction, and he handled the legal contracts. Vince was brilliant, but he was also ruthless. He viewed the law not as a shield, but as a sword. Our partnership ended amicably when he left the construction business to open a high-stakes corporate law firm in the city. We had not spoken in a decade, but I knew he was exactly the kind of monster I needed on my side to tear my family apart. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. I did not offer any warm greetings or polite small talk. I told him my wife and son had stolen my life savings, forged a medical diagnosis to declare me incompetent, and were actively plotting to end my life by tomorrow afternoon to collect the insurance money. I told him I needed the most aggressive legal defense money could buy, and I needed it right now. Vince was silent for a long moment, processing the absolute gravity of my words. When he finally spoke, his tone was completely devoid of sympathy, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating thrill of a predator catching a scent. The battle lines were drawn, and I was no longer the prey. The phone felt heavy in my hand, like a brick of solid lead. I sat in the dim light of my home office, surrounded by the financial wreckage of my life, and dialed a number I had not called in 10 long years. I listened to the sterile rhythmic ringing on the other end of the line. I was calling Vince Powell. Decades ago, Vince and I had built our first commercial development firm from the ground up. I was the muscle, the man who knew how to pour a foundation that could withstand a hurricane. Vince was the mind. He knew how to draft a legal contract that could completely strip a man of his livelihood without ever breaking a single law. Our partnership ended amicably when he decided to trade his hard hat for tailored suits and a corner office downtown. Over the years, he had built a formidable reputation as the most ruthless corporate attorney in the state. He was a man who viewed empathy as a severe professional liability. Right now, I did not need a sympathetic friend to offer me warm condolences. I needed a shark. I needed a predator to help me destroy the predators who had invaded my home. The line clicked open. Vince did not offer a friendly greeting or ask how my retirement was treating me. He simply answered with his last name, his voice sharp, impatient, and completely commanding. I told him it was Stanley. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries or nostalgic small talk. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripped of any emotion. I told him that my wife and my son had forged comprehensive medical records to declare me legally incompetent. I told him they had completely drained my liquid assets, funneling my entire life savings into a mysterious shell company. I read him the limited liability corporate registration number I had just pulled from my digital bank statements. I told him I needed to know exactly what kind of financial conspiracy I was dealing with, and I needed to know right now. Vince did not gasp. He did not ask if I was sure about my accusations. He simply told me to hold the line. I heard the rapid, aggressive clattering of his keyboard echoing through the speaker. Every keystroke sounded like a heavy iron nail being driven into the coffin of my 40-year marriage. I paced the length of my home office while I waited. I stopped in front of the framed blueprints hanging on my wall. They were the original architectural drawings for this very house. I had built this sanctuary with my own 2 hands. I had laid every brick and framed every wall to ensure my family would always have a safe, impenetrable fortress. Now those same family members were trying to bury me beneath the floorboards. The typing abruptly stopped. Vince took a slow, heavy breath. When he spoke again, the clinical detachment in his voice sent a freezing wave down my spinal cord. He told me the shell company belonged entirely to my daughter-in-law Valerie, but the missing cash from my high-yield savings account was only a fraction of the nightmare. Vince explained that just 1 week ago, a massive secondary mortgage had been approved and executed against my property. My home, the house I had painstakingly built and paid off 20 years ago, was now leveraged to the absolute maximum legal limit. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. I asked him how a bank could possibly approve a mortgage of that staggering magnitude without my physical presence, my verbal consent, or a rigorous verification process. Vince read the horrifying details directly from the restricted public registry. Cynthia and Cameron had bypassed me completely. They had submitted the forged neurological evaluation to a predatory private wealth lender. The fraudulent document legally certified that my mind was rapidly deteriorating from aggressive dementia. Under the guise of acting as my primary caregivers and wielding an emergency financial power of attorney, they had secretly established they secured the massive loan. They claimed the funds were required to finance my impending expensive around-the-clock medical care. They had painted a tragic, convincing picture of a devoted family liquidating their patriarch's estate to pay for his survival. The private bank approved the massive loan based solely on the pristine, spotless credit score I had fiercely maintained my entire adult life. The instant the hundreds of thousands of dollars cleared the bank, the money was wired directly into Valerie's out-of-state shell company. I stood frozen in the center of my office. The sheer scale of their betrayal was suffocating. I told Vince I was going to call the local police department immediately. I told him I was going to throw all of Cynthia and Cameron's belongings onto the front lawn. I wanted to watch them get arrested in the driveway. I wanted them out of my house right this second. Vince cut me off with a harsh, unforgiving command that echoed through the quiet room. He told me that acting on my burning anger would leave me completely destitute. If I exposed the fraud and kicked them out today, the criminal charges might eventually stick to my family, but the absolute financial devastation would stick permanently to me. Cynthia and Cameron had already funneled the stolen mortgage money directly into Cameron's failing technology startup. The cash was gone, completely absorbed by his mountain of outstanding corporate debt. Vince warned me that if I invalidated their fraudulent power of attorney right now, the private lender would immediately move to foreclose on my property to recover their lost funds. The bank would seize my house. I would be left standing on the curb with absolutely nothing to my name. I asked Vince what I was supposed to do. I told him I could not sleep under the same roof as the people actively plotting my demise. I could not look my wife in the eye knowing she had secretly mortgaged the ground beneath my feet and planned to poison my tea the following evening. Vince told me I had to do exactly that. He explained that a local property dispute or a messy family fraud case would drag on in civil court for years, draining whatever resources I had left. We needed leverage that completely superseded local jurisdiction. We needed a massive federal crime. Vince meticulously broke down the legal mechanics of his trap. Because the forged mortgage funds were transferred across state lines into Valerie's corporate account, the local theft had already escalated into federal wire fraud. But to secure an airtight conviction and to force the federal government to completely void the fraudulent debt, we needed to catch them actively executing the final phase of their conspiracy. We needed irrefutable recorded proof that they were physically attempting to finalize the hostile takeover against my will. We needed to catch the predators with the proverbial smoking gun in their hands. Vince warned me that the next 48 hours would be the most dangerous hours of my entire life. I had to become the perfect victim. I had to let them believe their flawless plan was working. I had to allow them to bring the corrupt neurologist and the crooked notary directly into my home to finalize the commitment papers. I had to look my executioners in the eye and smile. I took a deep breath, letting the icy resolve harden my racing heart. I agreed to his terms. I hung up the phone and placed it flat on my desk. The room was perfectly silent, but the war had officially begun. The burner phone vibrated against the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The harsh mechanical buzzing shattered the heavy silence of the room. I stared at the cheap plastic device. It looked entirely out of place next to my leather-bound ledger and architectural drafting tools. I picked it up. The screen illuminated my calloused hands. A new text message from Cynthia had just arrived. I opened the thread. I braced myself for another logistical update on her fraudulent real estate scheme. What I read was infinitely worse. It was a precise and clinical recipe for my murder. Cynthia laid out her plan with the cold efficiency of a contractor ordering building materials. She specified the exact medication she had acquired from a disgraced clinic. She listed a heavy central nervous system depressant, detailing the exact milligram dosage required to stop a human heart without leaving an obvious chemical trail. She typed that she would grind the heavy pills into a fine powder and dissolve them completely into my evening chamomile tea. I read her words over and over. She assured Cameron that the county coroner would never look twice at the scene. She wrote that a 65-year-old man with a decades-long history of strenuous physical labor suffering a fatal cardiac event in his sleep was the most natural thing in the world. She promised him there would be no autopsy, no toxicology report, and absolutely no questions asked. She was completely confident in her ability to murder me and walk away a wealthy, grieving widow. The screen flashed again. Cameron replied instantly. He did not express a single ounce of hesitation. He did not question the morality of murdering the man who had raised him. He sent a string of celebratory messages, followed by a sickeningly enthusiastic paragraph. He told his mother that he had already been browsing dealership inventory online. He detailed the exact specifications of the imported luxury sports car he planned to purchase the moment the quadrupled life insurance policy paid out. He complained about the interior color options, whining that he might have to wait an extra month for a custom matte black finish. My own son was treating my impending murder like a winning lottery ticket. I sat in the dark and stared at the glowing screen. A profound and hollow ache opened up inside my chest. I remembered carrying Cameron on my shoulders through active construction sites when he was a toddler. I remembered working 80-hour weeks in the blazing summer sun, pouring concrete and hauling lumber just to afford his exorbitant private school tuition. I had broken my body to ensure he would never have to struggle. I thought my relentless sacrifice was an expression of love. I now understood it was merely the financing of my own destruction. My generosity had bred a monster. Cameron did not view me as a father. He viewed me as a highly profitable stepping stone. He viewed my life as a minor obstacle standing between him and a European sports car. I placed the burner phone back onto the desk. The crushing weight of the betrayal evaporated. The sorrow burned away, leaving behind an absolute and freezing emptiness. The man who had loved Cynthia and Cameron ceased to exist in that moment. The devoted husband and the sacrificing father died at that desk, murdered by a text message. In his place, the general contractor returned. The man who knew how to calculate load-bearing walls, how to demolish rotten structures, and how to build traps that could crush anything foolish enough to step inside. I was no longer dealing with a family. I was dealing with a hostile demolition crew, and I knew exactly how to outbuild them. I picked up my own encrypted tablet and began taking meticulous notes. Cynthia was arriving tomorrow afternoon. She believed she held all the cards. She believed her husband was a tired, naive old fool who would eagerly accept a cup of poisoned tea from her loving hands. I needed to let her believe that illusion right up until the steel jaws of the federal trap snapped shut around her wrists. I could not simply pour the tea down the drain and confront her. That would only tip her off and give them a chance to destroy the physical evidence. I needed to secure the absolute proof of her intent. I needed the poisoned tea secured in federal custody. My mind worked through the logistics with clinical precision. I needed an exact duplicate of the heavy ceramic mug Cynthia always used to serve my evening tea. I needed a flawless sleight of hand to swap the poisoned drink with a safe one right in front of her eyes. And most importantly, I needed an unblinking, indisputable witness to capture her slipping the lethal drugs into my drink. A witness that could not be manipulated, bribed, or silenced in a courtroom. I looked up at the smooth white ceiling of my home office, tracing the electrical wiring paths in my mind. If I was going to catch them committing federal wire fraud and attempted murder, I needed eyes everywhere. I reached for my phone to dial a specialized private security firm. I needed to turn my sanctuary into a digital surveillance fortress before the sun came up. Vince Powell's voice came through the phone speaker with the absolute clinical precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate a limb. He laid out the strict, unforgiving parameters of a federal sting operation. We could not simply march into a local police precinct and present the burner phone or the digital bank statements. Vince explained that local jurisdictions were notoriously hesitant to prosecute complex family financial disputes. Cynthia could easily claim her phone had been hacked, cloned, or stolen by a malicious third party. Cameron could hire a slick defense attorney to argue the mortgage transfer was an authorized, albeit poorly executed attempt to secure funds for my rapidly declining health. To lock them in a federal penitentiary, Vince needed irrefutable, undeniable proof of two simultaneous acts. We needed high-definition, continuous video of Cynthia physically preparing and serving the poisoned tea. We also needed uninterrupted footage of Cameron Valerie and their corrupt accomplices finalizing the fraudulent deed transfer while I was physically incapacitated. If we missed either element, or if the chain of evidence broke for even a single second, they would slip through the legal cracks and walk away with my entire estate. Vince instructed me to pack a small bag, leave the house immediately, and check into a secure, anonymous hotel on the other side of the city. He promised to contact his liaisons at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and initiate the warrant process. He wanted to pull me out of the kill zone. I refused. I told Vince I was not going to cower in a cheap motel room while my wife and son dismantled the legacy I had broken my back to build. They wanted a helpless, confused old man to fall perfectly into their trap. I decided to give them exactly what they ordered. I chose to become the bait. Vince warned me of the fatal risks. He stated clearly that if Cynthia altered her dosage, if she decided to force the pills down my throat, or if I failed to intercept the poisoned tea with a flawless sleight of hand, I would be dead before the federal agents could breach my front door. I accepted the risk without a single tremor in my voice. I hung up the phone and walked back down the hallway toward the master bathroom. The initial surge of adrenaline had completely burned away, leaving a strange mechanical calm in my muscles. I stood over the shattered cedar skirting and the broken ceramic tiles. The destruction was the perfect alibi. It looked exactly like the clumsy, dangerous mistake of a deteriorating mind. I picked up the heavy steel lockbox. I wiped my dusty fingerprints from the smooth metal and carefully wedged it back into the dark cavity beneath the plumbing. I positioned the broken wooden panels around it, ensuring the box was only partially visible. It was just enough to show Cynthia that her secret had been exposed through a simple domestic accident. I wanted her to feel a sharp, blinding spike of panic when she walked through the bedroom door. I wanted her to believe she had to accelerate her timeline and strike before I could show those medical documents to anyone else. I left the heavy sledgehammer and the steel crowbar dropped haphazardly on the wet floor. I kicked a few pieces of splintered cedar across the hallway to create a trail of chaos. I was actively crafting the scene of a cognitive disaster. I moved to my home office to complete the illusion. For decades, I had maintained this room with immaculate precision. Every architectural blueprint, every tax return, and every construction contract was perfectly filed and categorized. Cameron had always mocked my obsessive organization, claiming it was a symptom of an uncreative mind. Now I used that meticulous history against him. I pulled out my filing cabinet drawers and began throwing thick stacks of paper into the air. I let old utility bills, bank statements, and building permits scatter like dead leaves across the hardwood floor. I knocked over a heavy ceramic cup filled with pens. I pulled my favorite leather armchair away from the desk and angled it awkwardly toward the blank corner of the room. I opened my personal checkbook and haphazardly tore out several blank checks, crumpling them and tossing them near the wastebasket. I remembered sitting at this very desk 20 years ago, drafting the structural plans for the treehouse I built for Cameron in the backyard. I had spent weeks ensuring every bolt and support beam was perfectly secure so my son would never fall. Now I was using the same desk to construct a legal gallows for him. I stripped away the nostalgia. I made the room look exactly like the habitat of a man losing his grip on reality. I made it look like a mind violently collapsing in on itself. I walked into the kitchen for the final touch. I opened the medicine cabinet and found the expensive herbal supplements and daily vitamins Cynthia always insisted I take for my joint pain. I dumped the capsules down the garbage disposal and left the empty plastic bottles scattered across the granite countertop. I pulled out a loaf of bread and left it sitting open on the stove alongside a puddle of spilled milk. I wanted to paint a picture of severe, undeniable disorientation. When Cynthia and Cameron arrived, they would not see a retired general contractor setting a deadly ambush. They would see a terrified, incompetent victim who had completely unraveled under the weight of his own failing brain. They would see a man ripe for the slaughter. I stood in the center of my ruined living room and looked at the antique grandfather clock ticking on the wall. I had transformed the fortress I built to protect my family into a flawless execution chamber. The staging was complete. The bait was set. The trap was fully primed. I sat down in my chair, rested my hands on my knees, and waited for the predators to come home. Saturday morning arrived with a mocking stillness. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. I stood at the counter brewing a pot of black coffee. The house was dead quiet. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive demolition. I took my mug and walked back into my home office, deliberately stepping over the scattered papers and overturned files I had strategically thrown across the floor the night before. I ignored the mess. My physical environment was a carefully staged disaster area designed to look like the habitat of a broken mind. But my digital environment needed to become an impenetrable vault. I sat in my heavy leather desk chair and woke up my encrypted laptop. The bright screen cast a harsh glow against my tired eyes. Cynthia and Cameron thought they had bled me entirely dry. They had drained the local checking accounts and cannibalized the equity in this very house. They firmly believed those local crumbs represented the absolute sum total of my life's work. They were remarkably arrogant, and arrogance breeds a very specific, fatal kind of blindness. Long before I met Cynthia, and long before Cameron was even born, I was a young, hungry contractor securing massive commercial bids. I lived on bad coffee, cheap diners, and pure ambition. When I successfully sold my first major development firm, I took the lion's share of that massive buyout and buried it. I never believed in leaving my survival to chance or trusting anyone completely with my independence. I established a private, high-yield retirement portfolio and locked it safely within an offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. I structured it through complex layers of corporate anonymity. When Cynthia and I married, I provided her a very comfortable life. I bought this sprawling house, bought her expensive cars, and fully funded our local joint accounts. I never saw the need to burden our marriage with the knowledge of a massive, untouchable fortune. It was my absolute safety net, a quiet guarantee that I would never end up destitute regardless of how the economy shifted. Now that hidden wealth was the only thing standing between me and total financial erasure. But a safety net is only as strong as the legal framework protecting it. The forged medical documents and the fraudulent power of attorney currently sitting in Cynthia's lockbox were incredibly dangerous weapons. A skilled financial investigator or a hungry probate judge could potentially use those forged signatures to cast a remarkably wide net. If Cameron and his desperate failing technology startup somehow stumbled upon a digital trail leading to the offshore trust, they would use the fake dementia diagnosis to rip those international accounts wide open. I could not leave a single digital door unlocked. I could not leave anything to chance. I checked the clock on the wall. It was barely 7 in the morning. I picked up my phone and called Vince Powell. He answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp, alert, and completely devoid of weekend lethargy. I told him we needed to initiate a complete and total lockdown on the Cayman Trust immediately. Vince understood the exact nature of the threat. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply explained the brutal legal mechanism we would deploy to secure the funds. Vince called it an irrevocable freeze mandate. By executing this specific legal clause, the trust would instantly become a financial black hole. No funds could be withdrawn, transferred, liquidated, or even viewed by anyone under any circumstances for a mandatory period of 90 days. It was a scorched earth defensive tactic. Vince warned me of the extreme severity of this action. He stated clearly that once the freeze was initiated, the legal barricade would apply to everyone, including me. If I suddenly needed emergency cash, I would not be able to touch a single dime of my own money. I would be completely locked out of my own empire until the 90-day cooling period expired. I told him I did not care about the inconvenience. I needed the money sealed in a titanium vault completely out of the reach of Cynthia's greedy fingers and the corrupt notary she had hired to stamp her fraudulent papers. I gave Vince my verbal authorization and recited the complex alphanumeric security code required to trigger the protocol. I heard the rapid aggressive clicking of his keyboard echoing through the phone speaker. Within 60 seconds, Vince paused and confirmed the deed was done. The offshore trust was now legally invisible, entirely untouchable, and completely locked down. I leaned back in my chair and took a long sip of the bitter coffee. The stark contrast of the situation was almost poetic. My wife and my son were actively conspiring to commit a flawless murder over an empty local bank account and a fraudulent secondary mortgage. They were scavengers fighting violently over table scraps, completely unaware of the absolute banquet, locked safely away on an island they would never visit. Their unhinged greed had narrowed their entire vision to the walls of this house. They had effectively sold their souls for pennies. My actual wealth was secure. The predators creeping into my life could no longer touch my legacy. But securing my money was only the first half of the battle. The financial threat was permanently neutralized, but the physical threat was rapidly accelerating. My phone buzzed aggressively on the desk. It was an automated calendar notification I had set days ago. Cynthia's return flight was scheduled to land at the local airport in just a few short hours. She would be walking through the front door this afternoon, armed with a lethal dose of untraceable sedatives and a perfectly rehearsed, loving smile. The financial fortress was built. Now I needed to turn my physical house into a flawless trap she could never escape. I finished the last drop of my coffee and stood up from the desk. I had to prepare the property for the surveillance team. The unmarked gray van pulled into my driveway precisely at 9 in the morning. There were no corporate logos on the side panels and no uniforms on the two men who stepped out of the vehicle. They carried heavy black equipment cases and moved with absolute silent efficiency. I had hired a boutique private security firm specializing in corporate espionage and high-threat asset protection. They did not ask questions about my wrecked bathroom or the chaotic state of my home office. They were paid to execute a specific technical request and leave no trace of their presence. I met them at the back door and handed the lead technician a detailed floor plan of my house. I circled 3 specific rooms with a red marker. The first target was the kitchen. This was the primary staging area for Cynthia's lethal recipe. I watched the technician set up his ladder beneath the ceiling smoke detector. He unscrewed the standard plastic casing and replaced it with an identical unit housing a microscopic high-definition camera. The lens was entirely invisible to the naked eye. It offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the granite countertops, the stove, and the exact cabinet where Cynthia kept my evening tea. Every movement in that room would be captured in pristine clarity. I wanted federal investigators to see the exact moment her fingers crushed those sedatives. The second target was the main living room. This was the theater where Cynthia would perform her role as the exhausted but loving wife returning from her fake business trip. The technicians swapped out the central smoke alarm above the coffee table. This camera angle covered the front door, the entryway, and the path leading down the hallway. It would document her arrival, her theatrical reaction to the broken bathtub, and the exact timeline of her movements through my home. The final target was my home office. This was the execution chamber. This was the room where Cameron and the corrupt neurologist would attempt to finalize their fraudulent paperwork over my incapacitated body. The technician installed the third camera directly above my heavy mahogany desk. It provided a perfect top-down view of the leather chair where I planned to stage my collapse. It would capture every signature, every exchanged document, and every face that entered the room. Visual evidence was only half of the legal requirement. Vince Powell had been very clear about the burden of proof for a federal conspiracy charge. We needed crystal-clear audio to capture their malicious intent. The second technician worked his way through the ground floor with a specialized drill. He embedded highly sensitive audio receptors directly into the wooden baseboards of all three rooms. The microphones were designed to pick up faint whispers and filter out ambient background noise. They would capture the sound of pills being crushed, the hushed conversations between my wife and my son, and the undeniable verbal confirmation of their plot. The installation took 3 agonizing hours. I stood in the hallway and watched the transformation of my property. I had built these walls to keep the dangers of the outside world away from my family. Now I was wiring the house to protect myself from the people living inside it. Every room felt different. The house was no longer a home. It was a digital witness, cold and impartial. The lead technician approached me and handed over a heavy, ruggedized tablet. The screen was locked behind complex encryption software. I typed in the 12-character alphanumeric password he provided. The screen illuminated, displaying a 4-panel grid. The live video feeds from the kitchen, the living room, and the office streamed in flawless high definition. I tapped the screen to test the audio feed from the kitchen. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator motor with absolute clarity. The surveillance network was perfectly integrated and entirely invisible. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick envelope filled with the cash I had withdrawn earlier that morning. I handed it to the technician. The transaction was completely off the books. There were no credit card receipts, no digital invoices, and no paper trails linking me to the security firm. Cynthia and Cameron would never find a single financial record to warn them of the trap. The technicians packed their equipment, nodded respectfully, and exited through the back door. The unmarked van backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. I was completely alone. I locked the back door and engaged the deadbolt. I walked back into my home office and surveyed the manufactured chaos. The scattered bank statements, the crumpled checks, and the overturned files looked exactly like the desperate actions of a man losing his grip on reality. I moved into the living room and sat down in my favorite armchair. The leather was worn and familiar, conforming to the shape of my back. I placed the encrypted tablet under a thick architectural magazine resting on the side table. The screen remained active, quietly broadcasting the silent, empty rooms of my house. I looked up at the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling. I knew the invisible lens was watching me. I regulated my breathing, slowing my heart rate down to a steady, calm rhythm. The frantic energy of the morning faded away. The anger retreated, leaving only a cold, hard focus. I thought about Cameron. I thought about the luxury sports car he planned to purchase with my life insurance payout. He believed my money was his birthright. He believed my physical labor was inherently inferior to his hollow corporate title. He had traded his father for a down payment on a European engine. I let that reality sink deep into my bones. It fortified my resolve. There would be no hesitation when the moment arrived. There would be no desperate plea for them, to reconsider their actions. They had already crossed the line of no return when they forged those medical documents and mortgaged this property. I ran through the timeline in my mind. Cynthia's flight was scheduled to land in 2 hours. She would drive straight to the house, rehearse her worried expression in the rearview mirror, and unlock the front door, expecting to find an easy victim. She expected to dictate the end of my life over a cup of chamomile tea. I checked my wristwatch. 1 hour remaining. The silence in the house was absolute. I closed my eyes and visualized the exact sequence of movements I needed to execute. The sleight of hand in the kitchen. the slurred speech, the heavy, dramatic collapse onto the mahogany desk. I had to perform the role of a dying man with flawless precision. Any minor deviation would trigger Cynthia's suspicion. I opened my eyes and fixed my gaze back on the heavy wooden front door. The physical preparations were finished. The digital snare was armed. Now the psychological warfare required my complete participation. The waiting was the hardest part of the operation. The quiet moments before the storm tested a man's nerves. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in the quiet house, fully prepared to tear my family apart and wait for the hunter to walk blindly into my trap. The heavy brass lock of the front door clicked loudly, breaking the absolute silence of the house. I sat perfectly still in my leather armchair and listened to the familiar sounds of my wife returning home. The heavy wooden door swung open on its hinges and banged softly against the wall. I heard the rhythmic thud of her designer suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor of the entryway. Cynthia sighed loudly. It was a perfectly calculated sound, designed to announce her presence and her supposed exhaustion from travel. She was stepping onto the stage and playing the role of the devoted partner, returning from a grueling business trip. I kept my eyes fixed on the blank wall ahead of me. I let my shoulders slump forward and allowed my hands to tremble slightly against my knees. I practiced the vacant stare of a man whose mind was slipping away. The trap was ready. All she had to do was walk into the room. I heard her footsteps moving deliberately down the hallway. She paused right outside the master bathroom. A sharp gasp echoed through the quiet house. It was a theatrical performance of absolute shock and horror. She cried out my name, letting her voice crack with manufactured panic. She dropped the handle of her suitcase and rushed into the living room. Cynthia stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me sitting in the corner. Her eyes darted rapidly around the room, taking in the scattered financial documents, the crumpled checks, the overturned ceramic cup, and the chaotic mess I had meticulously created in my home office. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped completely. I saw a brilliant flash of predatory triumph illuminate her face. She saw the destruction. She saw the broken bathroom tiles. She saw the exact scenario she desperately needed to justify her terrible crimes to the outside world. She quickly recovered her composure and rushed to my side with alarming speed. She dropped to her knees beside my armchair and placed her manicured hands over my trembling fingers. Her skin felt completely ice-cold against mine. She asked me what happened in a voice dripping with saccharine concern. She asked me why the bathroom was destroyed and why my important papers were thrown all over the floor like garbage. I looked down at her with a vacant, empty expression. I played my part flawlessly. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I blinked slowly, pretending my brain was struggling to process her simple questions. I told her I was just trying to fix a minor leak under the bathtub. I let my voice trail off into a confused, helpless whisper. I told her I could not find my favorite wrench, and then somehow I lost track of time and started looking through old files instead. Cynthia squeezed my hands tightly. The fake pity radiating from her eyes was absolutely suffocating. She asked me if I knew what day it was. I hesitated, deliberately furrowing my brow to simulate deep confusion. I looked toward the window and then back to her face. I mumbled that it was Tuesday morning. It was actually late Saturday afternoon. The satisfaction emanating from her body was almost palpable. She was standing in the presence of a man she believed was losing his mind entirely. She spoke to me in the slow, exaggerated tone one might use to soothe a frightened child or a sick animal. She told me I had made a terrible mess, but promised that everything was going to be perfectly fine. She assured me she was here to take care of me now, and I did not have to worry about fixing anything ever again. She stood up and smoothed the fabric of her expensive travel skirt. She looked down at me with an expression of profound, sickening sympathy. Every word she spoke was coated in poison. She told me I had been working far too hard for far too many years. She said my poor mind was simply exhausted, and my body was finally giving out under the pressure. She gently stroked my hair, Her touch made my skin crawl with revulsion, but I forced myself to lean into her hand. I acted like a grateful, frightened old man, desperate for his capable wife to save him. She told me to forget about the broken tiles or the scattered banking ledgers. She promised she would clean up the entire disaster tomorrow morning. She told me she would handle all the difficult burdens from now on, so I could just rest. Cynthia walked around the armchair and began to massage my tense shoulders. I knew the invisible camera mounted inside the smoke detector above us was capturing every single movement. It was recording the false affection and the hidden malice with perfect clarity. She leaned down and whispered softly into my ear. She told me I looked incredibly pale and dangerously stressed. She said she knew exactly what I needed to calm my fragile nerves. She offered to go into the kitchen and prepare my favorite evening tea. She said a warm cup of chamomile would soothe my anxiety, lower my blood pressure, and help me get a long, deep sleep. The emphasis she placed on the word sleep was chilling. I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the floor. I mumbled a pathetic, grateful thank you. I told her I was feeling very tired, and a warm drink sounded absolutely perfect. Cynthia smiled brightly. It was the smile of an executioner who had just convinced the condemned man to tie his own noose. She gave my shoulders one final reassuring squeeze. She told me to stay right there in my chair and rest my eyes while she went to boil the water. She promised she would be right back with my special drink. I listened to the sound of her expensive heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she walked out of the living room and headed straight toward the kitchen. My mind tracked her movements perfectly through the walls of the house. I knew exactly what she was doing right now. She was standing at the granite counter directly beneath the second hidden camera. She was reaching into the upper cabinet to retrieve my heavy ceramic mug. She was turning on the stove to boil the water. And most importantly, she was reaching into her designer purse to pull out the plastic bag of crushed lethal sedatives. The digital witness was recording every single second of her preparations. It was capturing the exact moment she transitioned from a deceitful spouse into an active murderer. The trap was springing shut around her, and she was completely oblivious to the danger. I sat alone in the living room and stared at the empty doorway. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was charged with a lethal electric anticipation. I knew she was currently dissolving a massive dose of central nervous system depressants into my drink. She was actively preparing to stop my heart. The woman I had loved for 40 years was standing 20 feet away, crafting my murder with the casual ease of a housewife making dinner. The reality of the situation washed over me, stripping away any lingering fragments of hesitation. I focused entirely on the mechanical steps I needed to take next. The sleight of hand was the most critical part of the entire operation, and it had to be executed without a single flaw. I took a slow, deep breath through my nose. I let the cold air fill my lungs, steadying my racing pulse. I had to remain perfectly in character when she returned. I could not let the boiling anger show in my eyes. I had to be the weak, compliant victim she expected to see. I listened to the faint whistling sound of the kettle boiling in the kitchen. The sound signaled the beginning of the end. Cynthia was about to walk back into this room holding a cup of poison. She believed she was serving me a death sentence that would secure her a life of luxury. She did not know she was actually serving herself a permanent cell in a federal penitentiary. I rested my hands on the armrests and waited for my loving wife to bring me my tea. I sat perfectly still in the leather armchair. The thick architectural magazine resting on my lap completely concealed the glowing screen of the encrypted tablet. My eyes were fixed on the digital grid. The top left panel displayed the live high-definition feed from the kitchen smoke detector. Cynthia stood at the granite island. She was entirely unaware of the invisible lens capturing her every microscopic movement. I watched the woman I had married 40 years ago casually open her designer purse. Her movements were calm and completely unhurried. She reached inside and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside the bag were 3 heavy sedatives. She placed them carefully on a wooden cutting board. She took the heavy steel base of my favorite coffee tamper and pressed down. I watched the pills shatter. She ground the pieces into a fine white powder. There was no hesitation in her hands. There was no tremor of guilt or doubt in her posture. She scraped the lethal dust into the steaming mug of chamomile tea. She picked up a silver spoon and stirred the hot liquid until the poison was completely dissolved. The visual evidence was perfectly captured. The federal investigators would see exactly what I was seeing: a cold-blooded murder being methodically prepared in a suburban kitchen. I slid the tablet further under the magazine and let my head drop back against the leather chair. I regulated my breathing. I had to look like a man whose mind and body were rapidly failing under the weight of severe cognitive decline. I heard the soft click of her expensive heels approaching down the hallway. Cynthia walked into the room carrying the heavy ceramic mug. She held it with both hands, presenting it like an offering of pure comfort. The warm scent of chamomile and honey filled the air between us. She wore an expression of absolute devotion. Her smile was soft and perfectly painted, masking the lethal intent swimming just behind her eyes. She approached my desk and gently set the mug down on the polished wood. She spoke in that same sickly sweet tone she had used earlier to calm my fake panic. She told me to drink up while it was hot. She promised the tea would soothe my frayed nerves and help me forget all the confusion of the broken bathroom and the scattered files. She reached out and patted my shoulder. Her touch felt like a freezing burn against my skin. I nodded weakly and offered a pathetic, grateful smile. I thanked her for taking such good care of me. I needed a distraction. I knew it was coming. Vince Powell and I had analyzed Cameron digital habits during our preparation. The boy was incredibly greedy and deeply impatient. He would need a status update. Right on cue, the sharp chime of a text message echoed from Cynthia's pocket. It was the pre-planned signal from our son demanding to know if the deed was done. Cynthia stepped back from the desk. She turned her body completely away from me to retrieve the phone from her purse. She took her eyes off the desk for exactly 4 seconds. That was all the time I needed. I reached down to the bottom drawer of my desk. I had prepped this exact maneuver hours ago while securing the room. I pulled out an identical ceramic mug filled with plain, harmless chamomile tea. In one fluid, silent motion, I swapped the safe cup for the poisoned one. I slid the lethal drink deep into the bottom drawer and pushed it shut with my knee. I placed my hands back on top of the desk and wrapped my fingers around the warm, safe mug. When Cynthia turned back around with a satisfied smirk on her face, the setup was complete. The illusion was utterly flawless. The poisoned evidence was locked away for the federal agents, and I was holding a simple cup of tea. She put her phone away and urged me to drink. I lifted the heavy mug to my lips. I blew on the hot liquid and took a long, slow sip. I let out a satisfied sigh. I told her it tasted perfect. Cynthia stood over me, watching with the unblinking focus of a predator waiting for the venom to take hold. I took another large gulp. I placed the mug back on the desk. Now I had to earn my federal witness status. I let a few minutes pass in complete silence. I stared blankly at the wall, allowing my eyelids to droop. I began to blink slowly, heavily. I let my breathing become shallow and uneven. I looked up at her and tried to speak. I deliberately slurred my words, letting my tongue drag heavily over the syllables. I told her I was feeling incredibly dizzy. I let my jaw go slack. I told her the room was spinning and my arms felt like solid lead. Cynthia did not offer to call for an ambulance. She did not reach out to comfort me. She simply stood there and watched me fade. The fake sympathy completely drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of cold anticipation. I let my head sway to the side. I knocked a stack of papers off the desk with a clumsy, heavy sweep of my arm. I groaned, mimicking the pathetic sound of a man losing consciousness. I let my upper body collapse forward. My chest hit the edge of the mahogany desk with a heavy thud. I rested the side of my face against the cool wood and closed my eyes. I let my arms hang lifelessly by my sides. The room fell utterly silent. I focused entirely on remaining perfectly still. I controlled my breathing, making the rise and fall of my back as nearly imperceptible. I waited for her to react. I heard the rustle of fabric as Cynthia stepped closer. I felt her cold fingers press firmly against the side of my neck, feeling for a pulse. I kept my muscles completely relaxed. She stood there for a long moment, ensuring I was completely incapacitated. She was satisfied. The heavy sedatives were supposed to mimic a massive cardiac event, shutting down the body over the course of the night. She believed the process had successfully begun. I heard her step back from the desk. The sharp, rapid tapping of a phone screen broke the silence. She was not dialing emergency services. She placed the phone to her ear. I listened intently. I knew the hidden audio receivers embedded in the baseboards were capturing every single syllable. The line connected. Cynthia spoke in a rushed, triumphant whisper. She told Cameron the package was delivered and the target was down. She told him to grab the documents and bring the notary to the house immediately. She said the coast was clear and it was time to finish the job. The final act of their betrayal had officially begun. I lay completely motionless against the hard wood of my desk, listening to the sound of my wife plotting the theft of my estate. I was ready to bring my entire family down. I kept the right side of my face pressed firmly against the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The wood was cool against my skin. The silence in the house was absolute until the sharp, aggressive screech of automotive tires tore through the quiet suburban afternoon. A heavy vehicle had just skidded violently into my driveway. Car doors slammed shut with loud metallic thuds that echoed through the glass windows. Heavy footsteps marched rapidly up the concrete front walkway. The front door did not open with a gentle, cautious click. It was shoved inward with tremendous force, crashing loudly against the drywall in the entryway. I regulated my breathing immediately. I slowed my heart rate down to a steady, rhythmic crawl. I took shallow, carefully measured breaths exclusively through my nose. I became a statue. I became a permanent fixture of the room. The predators had officially crossed the threshold of my sanctuary. Multiple sets of footsteps marched down the long, central hallway. They were not walking with the hesitant, careful tread of people entering a home where a severe medical emergency had just occurred. They marched with the heavy, arrogant boots of an invading army claiming a conquered territory. I heard Cameron speaking in a hurried, hushed tone, directing the group straight toward the open door of my home office. The shifting light warned me of their approach. The shadows in the room shifted dramatically as 4 distinct figures crossed the doorway. I kept my eyes closed, leaving only a microscopic slit to observe the light changing against the floorboards. The atmosphere of the room altered instantly. The familiar, comforting scent of old paper and cedar wood was completely overwhelmed by the sharp, synthetic odor of Valerie's expensive designer perfume and the sterile scent of clinical alcohol clinging to the doctor. Cameron stepped forward into my line of sight. He did not cry out in shock. He did not rush to my side with the desperate, frantic panic of a loving son finding his father collapsed over a desk. He walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, admiring the scene. I felt the air move as he leaned closely over my body. He stood so close I could hear the rapid, excited rhythm of his breathing. He did not touch me to offer comfort. Instead, a pair of cold, latex-covered fingers pressed firmly against the side of my neck. It was the corrupt neurologist Cameron had bribed. The doctor pressed his fingers directly against my carotid artery. I forced my muscles to remain completely limp. I aggressively suppressed the primal instinct to flinch or pull away. I kept my pulse deliberately slow and faint, mimicking the exact symptoms of a failing cardiovascular system. The doctor stepped back after a long, agonizing minute. He announced in a dry, clinical voice that my heart rate was bottoming out, and my respiratory system was actively shutting down. He confidently declared to the room that the heavy central nervous system depressant was working exactly as Cynthia had promised, and that I would be clinically deceased within the hour. A sharp, cruel laugh echoed loudly through the quiet room. It was Valerie. She stepped away from the desk and began walking around my office, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor I had painstakingly laid, piece by piece, 20 years ago. She complained loudly about the smell of the house. She said the entire property reeked of cheap sawdust old drywall and pathetic blue-collar sweat. She told Cameron that the very first thing they needed to do, the very moment my heart officially stopped beating, was to hire a heavy demolition crew. She spoke with gleeful, unrestrained excitement about running a massive industrial bulldozer straight through the front living room. She wanted to tear down the solid oak structural beams and smash the custom stone fireplace into absolute dust. She outlined her grand vision for a sleek, modern, sterile glass structure that she could instantly flip to a wealthy overseas investor for triple the current market value. She viewed the safe haven I had built to protect my family as nothing more than an ugly, outdated piece of trash standing squarely in the way of her luxury lifestyle. She did not possess a single ounce of respect for the decades of backbreaking labor it took to secure the land beneath her designer shoes. Cameron eagerly joined in her cruel laughter. The sound of my own son mercilessly mocking my life's work felt like a heavy iron blade twisting deep inside my stomach. I lay perfectly motionless on the desk and listened to him brag. He spoke directly to the crooked notary standing silently near the doorway. Cameron gloated about how incredibly easy it had been to outsmart me. He strutted around the room boasting that a man who spent his entire life working with his hands simply lacked the intellectual capacity to recognize a sophisticated financial trap. He told the notary that I was just a tired, outdated contractor who foolishly believed in loyalty and hard work, completely blind to the ruthless reality of the modern corporate world. Cameron detailed their entire criminal scheme out loud, feeding a golden continuous stream of verbal confessions directly into the invisible microphones hidden inside my wooden baseboards. He bragged about establishing the fraudulent shell company across state lines. He laughed about forging my signature on the massive secondary mortgage application. He openly admitted that the fake dementia diagnosis was a brilliant stroke of genius that allowed them to completely bypass my legal consent and steal my equity right out from under me. The notary chuckled softly, unzipping a heavy leather briefcase and unfolding a thick stack of legal documents. He clicked his expensive pen ready to work. They were actively preparing to transfer the final absolute control of my entire estate right over my supposedly dying body. The psychological torture of listening to my own flesh and blood enthusiastically celebrate my murder was agonizing. Every single word Cameron spoke was a heavy steel nail driven forcefully into the coffin of our father and son relationship. I desperately wanted to rise from the desk, grab him by his expensive tailored collar, and throw him straight through the glass window. I wanted to smash the corrupt doctor's face into the floorboards and watch Valerie run screaming out into the street. The intense physical urge to fight back roared through my veins like a raging fire. But I kept my body absolutely paralyzed. I kept my breathing incredibly shallow. I fiercely maintained the illusion of a failing, poisoned old man. I knew that rising from the chair right now would instantly ruin the federal sting operation. If I stopped them before they signed the final fraudulent deeds, a slick corporate defense lawyer could potentially argue their way down to a lesser charge. I needed them to completely execute the crime. I needed the black ink to dry permanently on the paper. I needed the absolute, undeniable proof of their conspiracy so captured permanently on the secure digital servers of my private security firm. I silently endured the mockery. I absorbed the vicious insults. I let my son stand over my slumped body and gloat about his flawless victory. I became the perfect silent witness to my own assassination. The trap was holding steady, and the scavengers were hungrily devouring the bait. I kept my eyes closed to a near-absolute darkness. I allowed only the thinnest sliver of light to filter through my eyelashes. My right cheek remained pressed hard against the polished mahogany of my desk. The wood was cold and unyielding. The room around me buzzed with a vile and electric energy. The four people standing inside my home office moved with the casual, arrogant confidence of scavengers circling a fresh kill. They truly believed I was already a ghost. They believed the heavy sedatives had completely severed my mind from my body. They were wrong. Every one of my senses was heightened to a terrifying degree. I could hear every breath, smell every scent, and register every single movement they made. Cynthia was the first to initiate the final phase of their conspiracy. I heard the sharp metallic zip of her designer leather purse opening. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy package. The distinct rustling sound of banded paper currency filled the quiet room. She stepped around my slumped body and moved toward the neurologist. She did not speak a word of gratitude or hesitation. She simply handed him the thick manila envelope. The doctor took it with eager hands. I listened to the rapid, greedy flick of his thumb as he peeled back the edge of the envelope to verify the stack of $100 bills inside. The transaction was remarkably cold. My wife was purchasing my medical execution with the cash she had stolen from my own bank accounts. The corrupt neurologist hummed a quiet note of satisfaction. He stepped directly up to my desk. He moved so close to my face that I could smell the sharp scent of his peppermint breath mints and the sterile chemical odor of his dry-cleaned suit. He placed his heavy leather portfolio right on top of my desk. The edge of his binder rested mere inches from my nose. He did not check my pulse. He did not shine a light into my eyes to test my pupil response. He simply clicked the tip of an expensive fountain pen and began to write. The scratching sound of the metal nib against the thick paper was deafening in my ears. He was filling out the official psychiatric commitment forms. With every stroke of his pen, he was legally erasing my autonomy. He was checking boxes that diagnosed me with severe aggressive and end-stage dementia. He was writing a completely fabricated medical narrative, claiming I was a violent danger to myself and others. He certified that I required immediate involuntary institutionalization in a locked facility. He was building the medical foundation for my permanent disappearance. He signed his name at the bottom of the document with a heavy, arrogant flourish. He pushed the papers across the desk toward Cynthia, assuring her that the facility would accept the transfer the moment they found my body in the morning. Cameron moved next. My son stepped up to the opposite side of the desk. He dropped a massive, heavy stack of legal documents onto the mahogany wood. The air displaced by the falling papers brushed against my face. These were the property deeds. These were the asset transfer authorizations and the final paperwork for the fraudulent secondary mortgage. Cameron leaned over the desk, bracing his weight by resting his hand directly on my shoulder. The sheer audacity of his touch made my blood run cold. He was using the body of his dying father to steady himself while he stole my entire legacy. He called out to Valerie, telling her to bring the notary forward. Valerie complained loudly as she crossed the room. She whined about the smell of the house, claiming the old wood and brick reeked of cheap labor and dust. She told Cameron she could not wait to bulldoze the entire property. She talked about my home, the house I had built with my bare hands, as if it were a disgusting stain on her shoe. She eagerly urged Cameron to hurry up so they could leave this pathetic blue-collar tomb and go celebrate at a high-end restaurant downtown. Cameron laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the walls of my office. He bragged openly to the room. He boasted about how incredibly simple it had been to outsmart me. He strutted back and forth, mocking my lifetime of hard work. He told the corrupt doctor that a man who spent his life pouring concrete and swinging a hammer simply lacked the intellectual capacity to understand modern finance. He called me a dinosaur. He proudly declared that my outdated loyalty and blind trust made me the easiest mark in the world. He bragged about establishing the offshore shell company and forging my signature on the mortgage applications. He fed a continuous golden stream of absolute confessions directly into the hidden microphones I had embedded in the baseboards just hours ago. Every insult, every boast, and every admission of guilt was flying straight onto a secure federal server. The quiet, nervous man standing in the corner finally shuffled forward. This was the crooked notary Cynthia had hired to rubber stamp their theft. He did not ask for my identification. He did not express a single ounce of concern for the man slumped unconscious across the desk. He simply opened his small leather pouch and pulled out his heavy brass official seal. Cameron pointed to the blank signature lines on the deed transfers. He had already forged my name in blue ink. The notary aligned his stamp. He pressed down with his body weight. A loud, heavy thud echoed through the room as the metal bit into the paper. He stamped the first page. He stamped the second page. He moved down the line, officially notarizing the complete theft of my home, my accounts, and my life savings. They operated with absolute and terrifying impunity. They were completely convinced they had won. They believed their victim was entirely neutralized, quietly fading away into the dark. Cynthia let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. She looked down at my motionless body and told Cameron that the heavy burden was finally lifted. She said they could finally stop pretending to care about a broken-down old man. They gathered the signed papers, the fake medical diagnoses, and the stamped deeds, carefully placing them into Valerie's designer tote bag. I kept my breathing shallow. I kept my muscles completely relaxed. I listened to them preparing to leave me alone in the dark to die. They had no idea that the federal trap was completely locked, and the hunters were about to become the prey. The heavy brass seal of the notary descended with a resounding terminal thud against the polished surface of my mahogany desk. The sharp sound echoed off the wooden paneling of the room, ringing in my ears like the slamming of a heavy iron vault door. I felt the sharp vibration travel through the solid wood and directly into my cheekbone. The corrupt official lifted his mechanical stamp, revealing the raised, perfect imprint of the state seal on the thick parchment. It was the final, undeniable validation of their sweeping financial theft. Cameron let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure adrenaline. I listened to the eager, frantic rustling of the paper as my son snatched the forged property deeds directly from beneath the notary's hands. Cameron slapped the man on the back, praising his quick and unquestioning service. The notary murmured a brief, transactional acknowledgement, quietly folding his fee into his dark leather briefcase. He had just facilitated the total liquidation of a man's life savings without asking a single question or feeling a single ounce of moral hesitation. The corrupt neurologist immediately took his place at the edge of the desk, stepping so close to my slumped body that the fabric of his tailored trousers brushed against my dangling fingertips. He clicked his silver pen and began to fill out the remaining sections of the official psychiatric commitment order. The sharp, rapid scratching of the metal nib against the thick medical forms sounded remarkably loud in the otherwise quiet room. He spoke aloud as he wrote, offering a cold, clinical narration of the fictional reality he was constructing for them. He stated that the patient had suffered a catastrophic physiological collapse, secondary to profound, unmanaged dementia. He signed his name with a heavy flourish, officially certifying that I was entirely incompetent, completely incapacitated, and required immediate transfer to a secured state facility should I somehow miraculously survive the night. He was handing Cynthia the absolute legal authority to lock me inside a padded room forever. He slid the completed medical documents across the smooth wood toward my wife. He assured her the facility director was a close personal colleague who would accept the transfer the moment the ambulance arrived in the morning, bypassing all standard legal protocols and family court hearings. Cynthia let out a long, triumphant sigh that ruffled the loose papers near my head. The crushing anxiety of her criminal performance evaporated entirely, replaced by the relaxed, arrogant posture of a woman who had just successfully executed the perfect crime. She walked away from my desk and moved toward the vintage crystal bar cart resting in the far corner of my office. I listened to the familiar, distinct clinking of heavy glass goblets being pulled from the wooden rack. The sharp squeak of a corkscrew twisting into a bottle pierced the silence, followed immediately by the dull, wet pop of the cork being pulled free. She was opening the incredibly rare bottle of French red wine I had purchased a decade ago to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary. The rich, heavy aroma of dark grapes and aged oak drifted across the room, mixing with the sterile scent of the medical forms. I heard the liquid splashing generously into the large crystal glasses. She walked back across the room, her footsteps slow and victorious. She handed one glass to Cameron and kept the other for herself. They stood directly over my supposedly dying body. The clink of their crystal glasses colliding in a celebratory toast rang out like a physical strike against my eardrums. Cameron took a deep swallow and praised the vintage, laughing that it tasted significantly better now that it officially belonged to him. Cynthia agreed, taking a long, slow sip of the stolen wine. She leaned her hip against the edge of the desk, relaxing completely into the moment of their shared victory. They were drinking a toast to my murder while my heart was still beating right beneath their hands. With the financial theft securely locked away in Valerie's designer tote bag and the medical cover story officially signed by a licensed physician, the group casually turned their attention toward the practical logistics of tomorrow morning. Valerie crossed her arms and asked Cynthia what they were supposed to do with the actual physical body once the paramedics finally hauled it out of the house. She complained that funerals were incredibly expensive and incredibly tedious, whining that a long mourning period would severely delay their ability to list the property on the open commercial market. She demanded they handle the disposal as quickly and quietly as humanly possible. Cynthia took another sip of her wine and agreed without a single shred of hesitation. She spoke about my impending funeral with a grotesque, chilling practicality that stripped away the last remaining illusions I held about the woman I had married. She assured Valerie that they were not going to waste a single dime of their newly acquired wealth on an elaborate memorial service or a fancy mahogany casket. Cynthia told the room that she had already researched the cheapest, most basic direct cremation services the state legally allowed. She laid out the brutal plan in a calm, conversational tone. There would be no public viewing. There would be no church service. There would be no published obituary in the local newspaper to alert my former colleagues or old friends. She planned to have my body transported directly from the county morgue to a discount incinerator on the industrial edge of town. Cameron laughed loudly at his mother's ruthless efficiency. He told her she was an absolute genius for cutting the dead weight so completely. He suggested they simply instruct the crematorium to dispose of the ashes in a communal scattering garden so they would not even have to bother picking up the cheap plastic urn. They wanted to erase my existence from the earth entirely. They wanted to obliterate my memory, destroy my home, and completely liquidate the financial legacy I had built through 40 years of relentless back-breaking labor. They spoke about me as if I were nothing more than a broken appliance that needed to be hauled out to the curbside trash before the new furniture could be delivered. I kept my eyes tightly shut and maintained the shallow, uneven breathing of a man rapidly slipping into a permanent coma. Every cruel joke, every clink of their wine glasses, and every single detail of their horrific logistical planning flowed directly into the highly sensitive audio receivers hidden inside the wooden baseboards beneath their feet. The microscopic camera lens embedded in the smoke detector above my desk recorded the exact moment the notary pressed his fraudulent seal onto the stolen deeds. It captured the corrupt doctor signing the fake psychiatric commitment order. It documented Cynthia and Cameron drinking expensive wine and smiling triumphantly over my slumped, poisoned body. The trap was no longer just armed. It was perfectly and permanently primed. They had crossed the threshold of no return. Every necessary element of a massive federal conspiracy was now completely executed, thoroughly documented, and finalized on a secure digital server. They had committed grand larceny, wire fraud, medical forgery, and attempted homicide with absolute arrogant impunity. They stood in my home and celebrated their brilliant victory, completely unaware that the silent, broken man lying on the desk had just handed them a permanent life sentence. The scavengers had consumed the poisoned bait, and the digital snare had snapped shut around their throats with inescapable force. All I had to do now was wait for the morning light. I lay perfectly still for exactly 3 more seconds. I let the arrogant, victorious laughter of my son and the cheerful clinking of my wife's crystal wine glasses burn themselves permanently into my memory. I wanted to remember the exact sound of their greed before I extinguished it forever. Then I opened my eyes. I did not groan in pain. I did not stumble or feign weakness. I placed my palms flat against the cool, polished mahogany surface of my desk and pushed my upper body upward. I aligned my spine, rolling my shoulders back until I was sitting perfectly straight and rigid in my heavy leather armchair. The sudden, deliberate movement was a violent disruption in the quiet room. The celebratory atmosphere shattered into a million pieces before a single syllable was spoken. Cynthia was standing near the center of the room mid-sentence, laughing at a cruel, dismissive joke Valerie had just made about my impending cremation. She turned her head casually toward my desk, expecting to look down at a corpse. Instead, she met my steady, unblinking gaze. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the vibrant color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face. She turned a chalky, terrifying shade of white. The muscles in her hands simply ceased to function. The expensive crystal goblet slipped from her paralyzed fingers and plummeted toward the earth. It struck the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the enclosed office like a gunshot. A massive pool of vintage dark red wine spread rapidly across the oak planks, soaking into the pristine rug like a spreading, bloody wound. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, gasping for air, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was staring at a ghost who had absolutely refused to die. Cameron spun around violently at the sound of the breaking glass. The arrogant, triumphant smirk was wiped from his face so quickly, it was as if he had been physically struck by an invisible hand. He stood frozen on the opposite side of the desk. In his right hand, he tightly clutched the freshly stamped forged property deed. His knuckles turned pure white from the desperate force of his grip. I watched the heavy official parchment begin to tremble violently as the horrific reality of the situation crashed into his nervous system. The brilliant, sophisticated corporate shark was suddenly reduced to a terrified, trembling child caught in the absolute worst lie of his entire life. He looked down at the paperwork, then at the empty, harmless cup of tea I had deliberately hidden in the bottom drawer, and finally back up to my steady eyes. He realized the fatal, unfixable flaw in his perfect master plan. He had drastically and fatally underestimated the man he had intended to murder. The corrupt neurologist took a rapid, stumbling step backward. He bumped forcefully into the vintage bar cart, rattling the remaining liquor bottles. His clinical, professional detachment dissolved into pure, raw panic. He looked down at the psychiatric commitment order. He had just signed the official medical document that falsely declared me comatose and actively dying. He realized instantly that he had just written out his own permanent prison sentence and destroyed his medical license. The crooked notary remained frozen near the doorway, like a deer caught in headlights. His hand hovered nervously over his heavy leather briefcase. He looked frantically around the room, instantly sensing that the highly lucrative, quiet transaction he had just facilitated was actually a massive, inescapable federal trap. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the raging, chaotic fury burning deeply inside my chest. When I finally spoke, my voice was a low, chilling whisper that commanded absolute and immediate authority. I looked directly at the trembling notary and instructed him to take his hand away from his briefcase immediately. I told him to leave the stamped, notarized documents exactly where they were sitting on the mahogany wood. I informed him in a voice devoid of all emotion that touching a single piece of paper on that desk would constitute the deliberate destruction of federal evidence. I highly recommended he keep his hands completely empty and visible if he wished to survive the night. The man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He immediately raised both his hands to chest level, stepping backward until his spine pressed flat against the drywall. Valerie let out a high, thin whimper of pure terror. She backed away from Cameron, trying desperately to physically distance herself from the epicenter of the crime. Cynthia finally managed to force a pathetic, broken sound from her throat. She stammered my name, taking a hesitant, trembling step forward. Her expensive designer shoes crunched loudly over the shattered crystal and spilled wine. She tried to form a coherent sentence, falling back on the comfortable, manipulative lies she had used to control me for 4 decades. She told me I was confused and sick. I raised a single index finger, stopping her dead in her tracks. I told her the theatrical performance was completely over. I calmly informed her that the digital cameras hidden inside the smoke detectors and the highly sensitive audio transmitters embedded in the baseboards had captured every single microscopic detail of her lethal recipe. I watched her gaze drift upward in sheer, paralyzing terror, desperately searching the blank ceiling for the invisible lenses that had meticulously documented her treason. Cameron finally found his voice. He dropped the forged deed onto the desk and took a sudden, aggressive step toward me. His face flushed a dark, violent crimson with humiliated rage. He demanded to know what I had done to them. He puffed out his chest, trying to salvage some pathetic fragment of control through physical intimidation. He genuinely thought he could still bully his way out of the room. He believed he could overpower a tired old man, seize the stolen documents, and escape into the night. He was tragically, fatally mistaken. Before Cameron could take a second step, the heavy wooden front door of the house burst open with a tremendous splintering crash that shook the entire foundation. The sound of multiple heavy combat boots charging rapidly down the central hallway vibrated through the floorboards. The quiet suburban evening was instantly and violently shattered by the blaring, aggressive wail of police sirens erupting from the street outside. Flashing red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness of the front yard, illuminating the large windows of my home office with a frantic, pulsing, inescapable rhythm. Vince Powell strode through the doorway with the unstoppable, terrifying force of a runaway freight train. My private security director did not look like the quiet, unassuming corporate consultant I had hired weeks ago. He was flanked closely by 2 seasoned federal fraud investigators wearing dark official windbreakers. They were followed immediately by 3 uniformed local law enforcement officers carrying drawn tactical weapons. Vince stepped directly in front of Cameron, using his broad shoulders to force my son to violently retreat until his back slammed hard against the wooden bookcase. The federal investigators fanned out aggressively across the room, securing the exits and taking immediate absolute control of the physical space. One federal agent stepped directly to my desk. He placed a heavy, transparent evidence bag directly over the forged property deeds and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. The local officers barked loud, sharp orders demanding everyone keep their hands clearly visible and step away from each other. The air in the room became incredibly thin and charged with static. The arrogant, greedy predators who had spent the last hour drinking wine and cheerfully celebrating my murder were now completely surrounded. They were trapped like rats inside the very house they had tried to steal. I remained seated comfortably in my leather chair. I folded my hands together and watched the chaotic, beautiful machinery of absolute justice unfold right before my eyes. The waiting was over. The heavy boots of the local police officers hit the hardwood floor with a rhythmic and terrifying finality. They moved with practiced precision. 2 armed officers flanked the heavy wooden double doors of the office to completely block any chance of escape. Another officer moved directly behind Cameron and firmly grasped his shoulder to keep him pinned against the tall bookcase. The lead federal investigator stepped forward to take absolute control of the scene. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a dark windbreaker that rustled loudly in the quiet room. He ordered everyone to remain exactly where they were and to keep their hands entirely visible. The thick atmosphere of arrogant celebration that had filled my office just moments ago evaporated completely. It was instantly replaced by the suffocating weight of absolute panic. Valerie pressed her back against the far wall. Her eyes were wide with pure terror as she clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest. The corrupt notary stood frozen in the corner, with his hands raised awkwardly in the air. He stared at his heavy brass stamp resting on the desk, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I sat comfortably in my leather armchair and surveyed the magnificent ruin of their grand conspiracy. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my authority. I spoke in a calm and even tone that carried clearly across the silent room. I instructed Cameron and Cynthia to look directly up at the ceiling. I raised my hand and pointed a steady finger toward the standard plastic casing of the smoke detector mounted directly above my desk. I watched their confused eyes track my gesture. I informed them that they were currently staring directly into a microscopic high-definition camera lens. I watched the blood completely drain from my son's face as the true gravity of his situation finally registered in his mind. I told the room that identical cameras were installed in the kitchen and the main living room. I explained that a highly specialized security firm had wired the entire property with invisible optical sensors and high-capacity audio receivers earlier that morning. I stated with absolute certainty that every single second of their entire criminal enterprise was currently uploaded and permanently secured on an encrypted federal server. I told Cameron that the digital microphones had captured every boastful confession he made about forging the secondary mortgage applications. I told the corrupt doctor that the cameras had perfectly recorded him signing a fraudulent psychiatric commitment order without ever conducting a basic medical examination. Cynthia began to shake violently. Her entire body trembled as she stared at the smoke detector. She tried to deny it. She stammered out a weak protest, claiming I was insane and making up ridiculous stories to hurt her. I reached down to the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk. I opened it slowly and pulled out a thick, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the sealed plastic was the heavy ceramic mug filled with the poisoned chamomile tea. I held it up for the entire room to see. The amber liquid sloshed gently against the sides of the glass. I turned to the lead federal investigator and handed the sealed bag directly into his waiting hands. I informed the agent that the liquid inside contained a lethal concentration of crushed central nervous system depressants. I told him my loving wife had ground the pills into a fine powder on our kitchen counter precisely 22 minutes ago, while looking directly into a hidden surveillance lens. I explained that I had executed a simple physical swap to trade her toxic drink with a safe cup while she was distracted by a text message from her son. The corrupt neurologist let out a pathetic choking sound. He looked at the sealed evidence bag and then down at his own trembling hands. He realized he had willingly tied his medical license to a premeditated murder plot for a simple envelope of cash. The lead federal investigator turned his sharp gaze toward the doctor. The agent stepped forward and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He ordered the neurologist to place his hands behind his back. The doctor's legs simply gave out. He sank to his knees on the hardwood floor and began to weep openly. He begged for mercy and pleaded that he was only following instructions for a quick financial payout. The federal agent ignored his pathetic cries. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. The investigator recited the Miranda rights in a cold and rhythmic voice. He informed the doctor he had the right to remain silent, and anything he said would absolutely be used against him in a federal court of law. Cynthia realized the inescapable reality of the trap. She saw the undeniable physical evidence resting in the hands of the federal agent. She saw the doctor crying on the floor in steel restraints. She instantly abandoned her role as the triumphant mastermind. She threw herself onto the floor near my armchair. She let out a loud theatrical sob and buried her face in her hands. She attempted to weaponize her tears just as she had weaponized my bank accounts. She looked up at the police officers with wide, pleading eyes. She claimed she was a desperate, terrified victim. She pointed a trembling finger at me and accused me of being a ruthless, controlling tyrant. She cried out that I had emotionally abused her for 4 decades and kept her trapped in a miserable, loveless marriage. She sobbed that she only wanted to secure a small piece of financial freedom to escape my suffocating grip. She told the federal agents that I had practically forced her into this desperate situation through my own intense cruelty and neglect. I did not attempt to interrupt her pathetic performance. I let her cry and scream her fabricated accusations to the armed officers filling my office. The federal agents did not move a single muscle to comfort her. They stood perfectly still and watched her thrash on the floor. When she finally ran out of breath and collapsed into quiet, heaving sobs, I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the heavy, ruggedized tablet the security technicians had given me that morning. I tapped the high-resolution screen and opened the secure audio file that had been recorded just a few moments before the police breached the front door. I turned the volume setting to its maximum limit and placed the tablet flat on the surface of my desk. I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio recording filled the quiet room. Cynthia's own voice echoed from the small digital speakers. It was not the voice of a desperate, terrified victim. It was the cold, calculating, and profoundly cruel voice of a predator. The recording played the exact moment she called Cameron to confirm my collapse. Her recorded voice practically sang with joyous triumph as she announced that the target was down and the package was delivered. The digital playback captured her eagerly urging her son to hurry up and steal my money so they could finally stop pretending to care about a broken old man. It recorded her laughing about how incredibly easy it was to serve me a death sentence in a warm cup of tea. The recording clicked to an end, and absolute silence descended over the home office. The silence was incredibly heavy and completely suffocating. It pressed down on Cynthia and Cameron like a physical weight. The theatrical tears instantly vanished from my wife's face. Her false victimhood was completely obliterated by the undeniable sound of her own malicious words. She sat frozen on the hardwood floor, staring blankly at the dark screen of the tablet. Cameron closed his eyes and let his head drop back against the bookcase. He knew there was absolutely no defense against his own recorded confessions. There were no more lies to spin and no more corporate loopholes to exploit. They had built an elaborate, magnificent lie to steal my entire life, and I had systematically dismantled it with the pure, unvarnished truth. I sat in my leather chair and looked down at the people who had tried to murder me. The victory was completely silent, but it resonated through my bones with absolute clarity. The room was already vibrating with the aftermath of the audio confession. The federal agents had the medical side of the conspiracy firmly secured in their grasp. Now it was time to dismantle the financial machinery that had driven the entire plot. Vince Powell stepped forward from the shadows near the doorway. He moved with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man holding all the winning cards. He carried a thick leather portfolio under his right arm. To anyone else, it was just a collection of papers. To Cameron and Valerie, it was the instrument of their total destruction. Vince did not raise his voice to command attention. He unzipped the portfolio, and the sharp sound made Valerie flinch. He pulled out a massive stack of heavily tabbed documents and handed the entire dossier directly to the lead federal investigator. The agent took the file and began flipping through the top pages. The silence in the office stretched out, becoming incredibly heavy and suffocating. I kept my eyes fixed on Valerie. The smug, impatient expression she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone. She stared at the manila folder in the agent's hands as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. Vince began to speak methodically, outlining the financial anatomy of their theft. He detailed the creation of a fictitious corporate entity designed specifically to launder my assets. He named the exact shell company Valerie had established just 6 weeks prior. He recited the company registration number, the date of incorporation, and the fake offshore address they had used to hide their true ownership. He explained to the federal investigators that Valerie had structured the corporation to absorb my physical property without triggering local tax alarms or raising red flags with my personal bank. Valerie's perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. She pressed her back against the tall wooden bookcase, her eyes darting frantically between the armed police officers and the exit. Vince did not stop. He pulled out the bank records. He showed the investigators the exact paper trail linking Valerie's personal accounts directly to the fraudulent shell company. He laid out the precise blueprints of her greed. She had planned to liquidate my home funnel, the cash through the fake corporation, and completely vanish the money into her private, untouchable investment portfolios. Cameron stood absolutely frozen beside his wife. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to offer some slick corporate defense or claim ignorance, but Vince cut him off with a single raised hand. Vince pulled a second set of documents from the portfolio. It was the application for the massive secondary mortgage they had taken out against my property. He presented the forged signature. He presented the digital timestamps showing exactly when and where Cameron had submitted the false application using my stolen identity. But Vince saved the most devastating piece of evidence for last. He turned to the lead federal agent and explained the exact routing of the stolen funds. Cameron had been too arrogant and far too impatient. He had been too eager to secure the cash to save his failing business. He had routed the initial mortgage advance through an out-of-state banking institution to clean the money before it ever reached Valerie's shell company. The lead investigator nodded slowly, processing the information. He looked up from the dossier and stared directly at Cameron and Valerie. He informed them in a cold, clinical tone that routing stolen funds across state borders fundamentally changed the entire nature of their crime. It was no longer a local property dispute. It was no longer a simple state-level fraud case that could be negotiated away with a hefty fine and a clever defense attorney. The very moment that wire transfer crossed state lines, their greedy scheme escalated into a massive federal felony. They were officially facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The reality of federal jurisdiction hit Valerie like a physical blow to the stomach. The punishment for a federal wire fraud conspiracy was not a suspended sentence. It was decades inside a maximum security penitentiary. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her breathing turned into rapid, shallow, desperate gasps. She clutched at the collar of her expensive silk blouse, suddenly desperate for air in the spacious room. The arrogant woman who had just minutes ago complained about the smell of my house and eagerly anticipated bulldozing my property was now collapsing entirely under the weight of her own arrogance. Her knees finally buckled. She slid down the front of the wooden bookcase until she hit the hardwood floor. She curled her arms tightly around her knees and began to sob uncontrollably. There was no fake pity or calculated manipulation in her tears. It was the raw, unadulterated terror of a predator who suddenly realized she was permanently caught in an inescapable trap. She understood that her life of luxury, her designer clothes, and her pristine social standing were over forever. Cameron stared down at his sobbing wife and then looked at the federal agents closing in around him. The sophisticated, untouchable businessman persona completely evaporated. He was entirely stripped of his pride and his false superiority. He turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes toward me. He took a hesitant step forward, reaching out with trembling hands. The local police officers immediately tensed their hands, dropping to their utility belts, but I motioned for them to wait. I wanted to hear exactly what my son had to say. Cameron fell to his knees on the carpet right in front of my desk. He began to beg. His voice cracked with sheer panic. He pleaded for mercy, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative of his profound betrayal. He swore the money was just a temporary loan. He claimed his startup company was on the verge of a massive breakthrough, and he only needed a temporary injection of capital to save his business from going under. He promised he was going to pay me back every single penny with interest. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and swore he never truly wanted to hurt me. He claimed the pressure had simply driven him to make a terrible temporary mistake. I looked down at the boy I had raised. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent working in the heat and the freezing cold to pay for his education. I thought about the sacrifices I had made to ensure he never had to struggle the way I did. I looked at his expensive, tailored suit, bought with the money he had stolen from my accounts. I looked at the dark red wine pooling on the floor from the glass his mother had dropped when she realized I had survived their assassination attempt. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering warmth. The profound, calculated betrayal had burned away all the parental affection I ever held for him. I leaned forward in my leather chair. I looked directly into his terrified, desperate eyes. My voice was quiet, incredibly steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that an honest man asks his father for a loan. I told him a desperate man might even forge a signature in a moment of weakness. But I looked at the empty cup of tea resting in the federal evidence bag. I stared straight into my son's soul. I told him that family does not crush lethal sedatives into a cup of chamomile tea. I told him that family does not poison family for seed money. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air, silencing his pathetic excuses permanently. The sharp, metallic snap of steel teeth locking into place became the loudest sound in the room. The lead federal agent secured the heavy cuffs around Valerie's wrists first. The cold reality of the metal seemed to break the spell of their invincibility. Cameron watched his wife's hands get bound together, and the remaining shreds of his sophisticated corporate facade crumbled into sheer, animalistic self-preservation. He did not offer her comfort. He did not stand by her side in a show of unity. Instead, he violently threw her to the wolves. Cameron pointed a shaking finger at his wife and shouted to the federal investigators that he had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore accounts. He frantically claimed the shell company was entirely her creation. He loudly insisted that Valerie had manipulated the legal paperwork, that she had used her own shady corporate connections to set up the fraudulent holding company, and that he was just a desperate husband blindly following her financial advice. He was completely willing to sacrifice the woman he married to shave a few years off his impending federal prison sentence. Valerie twisted around her eyes, widening in pure, venomous betrayal. The tears of panic instantly turned into tears of absolute rage. She spat back at him, her voice echoing harshly off the mahogany walls. She screamed that she would never have touched the fraudulent mortgage if he had not destroyed their lives first. She turned to the room and loudly exposed the secret he had been hiding behind his tailored suits and expensive cars. She screamed about the underground sports betting. She screamed about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had lost to violent off-the-books lenders over the past 2 years. She told the federal agents that Cameron was not a brilliant businessman seeking seed money for a new venture. He was a degenerate gambler who owed dangerous people a massive fortune, and he had been willing to sacrifice his own father to pay off his debts before those lenders came to break his legs. The truth spilled out like acid, burning away the last of their shared lies and exposing the rotten core of their marriage. Cynthia watched the mutual destruction of her family play out directly in front of my desk. She watched her son and her daughter-in-law tear each other apart like cornered animals. The corrupt neurologist was already being led toward the hallway, weeping softly into his chest. The fake notary was pinned against the wall, silently listening to a police officer read his Miranda rights. Cynthia finally realized that there was no legal loophole, no clever excuse, and no manipulative lie left to spin. The money was gone. Her pristine social standing was gone. Her freedom was gone. She looked at me. For the first time in 40 years, the tears streaming down her heavily powdered cheeks were completely genuine. They were born of pure, unadulterated terror. The prospect of losing her luxury and facing the brutal reality of a concrete cell shattered her completely. She took a desperate, stumbling step toward me. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers grasping at the empty air between us. She begged me to stop them. She cried out my name, pleading with me to tell the armed officers it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She appealed to the decades we had spent together, begging me to remember our marriage, to remember the vows we took, and to remember the life we had built. She promised she would make it right, sobbing that she was just confused and overwhelmed by the stress of my declining health. I looked at her outstretched hands. I looked at the woman who had crushed sedatives into my tea with a calm, practiced smile on her face. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow or heartbreak. I felt an overwhelming, profound emptiness. I took a single, deliberate step backward. The physical distance between us was only a few inches, but it represented an infinite, unbridgeable chasm. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, and my expression remained completely devoid of emotion. I told her that the man she married died the exact moment she handed the corrupt doctor an envelope of stolen cash to sign my life away. I told her that I was simply the ghost who had stayed behind to hold her accountable. The local police officers stepped in. They firmly grasped Cynthia by the arms, pulling her away from my desk. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, joining the chorus of bindings that now held my former family captive. I stood in the center of my office and watched in absolute silence as the officers began the procession. They marched Cameron out first. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, muttering frantic, useless apologies to the empty air. Valerie followed, sobbing uncontrollably, her designer shoes dragging heavily across the hardwood floor. The corrupt doctor and the fake notary were escorted out, right behind them, two greedy opportunists who had traded their careers and their freedom for a few stacks of $100 bills. Finally, the officers guided Cynthia toward the door. She looked back at me one last time over her shoulder, her face a mask of ruined arrogance and utter despair. I did not look away, and I did not offer a single ounce of comfort. I simply watched the heavy wooden doors of my office close behind her. I followed them slowly down the hallway and stepped out onto the front porch of my home. The cool night air hit my face, washing away the sterile scent of the medical forms and the sour smell of spilled wine. The scene in my front yard was a chaotic symphony of justice. 4 police cruisers and 2 unmarked federal vehicles were parked haphazardly across the lawn and the driveway. The brilliant flashing red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the neighborhood in a pulsing, relentless rhythm. The intense strobe lights bounced off the manicured hedges and the brick facades of the surrounding houses. My neighbors were standing on their porches and lawns, their coats pulled tight against the chill, watching the spectacle unfold in stunned silence. They watched as the prominent, wealthy family they thought they knew was systematically loaded into the back of secure police vehicles. They watched Cameron, who had always bragged loudly about his corporate success at neighborhood block parties, getting his head pushed down as an officer guided him into the caged back seat of a cruiser. They watched Cynthia, who had always paraded her expensive jewelry and high society connections, shivering in the cold night air with her hands bound firmly behind her back. The heavy metal doors of the police cruisers slammed shut one by one. The sharp, heavy thuds echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was the sound of absolute finality. The doors locked firmly, caging the predators who had smiled while plotting my demise. I stood on the porch and took a deep, steadying breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had been carrying in my chest for weeks was finally gone. I had not raised my hand in violence. I had not screamed or lost my composure. I had simply used their own blinding arrogance against them. I had let their greed build the very prison that now held them. As the police vehicles shifted into gear and began to roll slowly down the street, taking my betrayers away forever, I turned around and walked back inside my house. The silence that greeted me was no longer a threat or a burden. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of a home that finally belonged only to me. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance. The transition from chaotic betrayal to profound stillness did not happen overnight. It required a methodical cleansing of my life. Vince Powell proved to be worth every single penny I paid him. With clinical precision, he and his team of forensic accountants dismantled the fraudulent financial architecture my son had built. They presented an airtight case to the federal courts. The fraudulent second mortgage that Cameron and Valerie had so eagerly taken out against my property was completely nullified. The forged signatures and the illicit wire transfers crossing state lines made the legal process incredibly swift and utterly devastating for them. The banks did not show a single ounce of mercy. Once the federal indictments were unsealed, the financial institutions moved with absolute ruthlessness to recover their stolen funds. They seized every single asset Cameron and Valerie possessed. Their luxury vehicles, their bloated investment portfolios, and their heavily leveraged commercial properties were entirely liquidated. The lavish lifestyle they had attempted to sustain by sacrificing my life collapsed into a mountain of insurmountable debt. The The courts froze their offshore shell company and clawed back the capital they had desperately tried to hide. They were left with absolutely nothing, completely ruined by their own catastrophic greed. The corporate empire Cameron thought he was building evaporated into thin air, exposing him as nothing more than a desperate criminal who had tried to steal his own seed money from his father. The justice handed down to Cynthia was equally absolute. The federal prosecutor did not offer her a lenient plea deal. The audio recordings and the physical evidence of the poisoned tea left no room for manipulation or false victimhood. She stood before a federal judge and was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The woman who had spent 4 decades obsessing over designer clothes country club memberships and pristine social standing was now relegated to a concrete cell. Her name, once synonymous with suburban luxury, was now a cautionary tale of ultimate betrayal. I did not attend her sentencing. I felt no desire to look at her one last time or listen to any tearful apologies. The anger and the profound sense of betrayal had long since burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear void. She had made a calculated decision to trade my life for a comfortable retirement, and the universe had simply handed her the exact retirement she deserved. The parasites that had drained my energy, my finances, and my spirit had been permanently excised from my world. I severed all legal and financial ties to her, ensuring that my legacy would remain completely untouchable. I stood barefoot on the cool surface of my pristine, newly remodeled master bathroom. The morning light filtered through the frosted glass window, illuminating the flawless geometric patterns of the floor. I had laid every single piece of tile myself. I had spent the last 3 months tearing out the old fixtures, ripping up the tainted floorboards, and pouring fresh concrete. I needed to work with my hands. I needed the physical exertion to completely purge the house of their lingering presence. The smell of fresh mortar and clean ceramic had replaced the suffocating odor of deceit. Every swing of the hammer and every careful measurement of the level was a step toward reclaiming my sanctuary. I remembered the feeling of the rough trowel in my hand, the satisfying weight of the tiles setting perfectly into place. I ran my fingers over the smooth, perfectly aligned grout lines. The physical labor had been exhausting, leaving my back aching and my hands calloused, but it had saved my sanity. I had built this house from the ground up decades ago, and I had just rebuilt it, cleansing it of the people who had tried to steal it from me. The house was no longer a monument to a fake family. It was a fortress of my own making. The space was completely mine again, washed clean by honest sweat and hard work. I left the bathroom and walked down the quiet hallway toward the kitchen. The absolute silence of the house was not lonely. It was incredibly rich and profoundly comforting. There were no manipulative whispers echoing from the living room. There were no greedy calculations being made behind closed doors. There were no fake smiles or hollow gestures of affection. I filled the glass carafe with fresh water and scooped dark, coarse grounds into the coffee maker. The machine hissed and sputtered, filling the kitchen with the rich, bitter aroma of dark roast coffee. I poured the steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and wrapped my hands around the warm surface. I walked to the front door, turned the heavy brass deadbolt, and stepped out onto the wide wooden porch. The crisp morning air filled my lungs. The neighborhood was quiet, just waking up to the gentle light of the early sun. The dew on the front lawn sparkled like crushed glass. I took a slow sip of the black coffee. The bitter taste was grounding, a sharp reminder that I was still breathing, still standing, and still entirely in control of my own destiny. I looked out over the manicured grass and the quiet street where the police cars had taken them away 6 months ago. Society tells us that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred bloodline that must be preserved at all costs. But I had learned the hardest lesson a man can ever learn. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty. A shared last name does not prevent a knife from being slipped into your back. Sometimes the people who call you family are simply waiting for you to close your eyes so they can take what is yours. I had lost my entire family. I had lost the wife I thought I knew, and the son I had sacrificed everything to raise. But as I stood on my porch, breathing in the clean air and listening to the peaceful silence of my home, I realized I had not truly lost anything of value. They were illusions. They were predators wearing the masks of loved ones. In losing them, I had reclaimed my empire. I had preserved the legacy I had built with 40 years of honest labor. Most importantly, I had secured my dignity and my absolute uncompromising freedom. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The air was fresh and unburdened. The war was officially over, and the rest of my life was finally mine alone. True family is never defined by shared blood or legal certificates. It is forged through unwavering respect, profound loyalty, and genuine love. When greed takes root, it acts as a silent poison, rotting the foundation of those sacred bonds. Stanley learned the devastating truth that the most dangerous predators are often those sitting at your own dinner table. He discovered that true wealth is not measured by property deeds or bank accounts, but by the quiet dignity of standing entirely on your own terms. Absolute peace arrives only when you find the courage to walk away from people who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming justice and fighting back against ultimate betrayal, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below.